Hello and welcome to Startup Gippsland Live, a place where both budding and established regional founders can feel right at home. We're here to inspire you to take the path less travelled, to make your idea a reality, and most of all, to hone your entrepreneurial skills so that you can grow and scale your business and realise your potential. Get ready for this episode of Startup Gippsland Live. Now here's your host, Zoe Doyle.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Startup Gippsland Live. I'm your host, Zoe Doyle, and today I'm very excited to be talking to Colin Kinner from Startup Onramp and Dr. Elena Kelareva of Startup Gippsland's own. Dr. Elena Kelareva is the founder of GippsTech, an award-winning digital innovation consultancy with the mission of growing regional Australian startup and tech ecosystems. Elena worked with the 6 local councils in Gippsland to create Startup Gippsland, one of the largest regional startup programs ever to be run in Australia. She's been recognised for her work on building regional startup and tech communities by being selected as one of 3 finalists for the Regional Development Victoria Leadership and Innovation Award in 2018 and a winner of the Pause Fest Super Connector Award in 2020. Colin Kinner is the founder and CEO of Startup Onramp. He's one of Australia's leading experts in startup methodology, and he's been deeply involved in the national startup ecosystem for 20 years, including as Program Director for the Horizons Accelerator, Investment Manager for the CEA Startup Fund, CEO of ilab Incubator and Mission Lead for the Startup Catalyst Silicon Valley Mission. Colin is also one of Australia's most experienced startup coaches and mentors, having worked with several hundred emerging entrepreneurs. Wow, we are in good company today. Elena and Colin, welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Zoe. It's good to be here.
Absolutely
thank
awesome.
You, Zoe.
It's awesome to have you. Thank you. And I'm so excited to introduce our listeners to, the wealth of knowledge that you both have in this space. So, Elena and Colin, you've both founded startup programs in Australia. Where did your passion to pursue this come from? And what's the journey been like for both of you?
So for myself, where my passion for startups came from was my first job out of uni actually was working for a startup that was 20 employees when I joined and about 30 when I left. And that gave me a bit of the experience of working for a small organization where you could get innovative ideas implemented, get projects approved fast. And through that time in my life, I also ended up engaging with the broader startup community in Melbourne. So that was when the Melbourne startup community was still fairly nascent. 15 years ago. So it was probably a bit more similar to where regional communities are today. So one thing that really drew me to working with startups is just how friendly and welcoming and supportive the communities are. I just really enjoyed going to startup events, meeting all these people who are passionate about the problem they were solving and who were working on innovative ideas that they didn't know yet would succeed, but they were willing to give it a go anyway. So I loved engaging with that community and wanted to work in the startup space myself longer term.
Wow, that's fabulous. And what about you, Colin?
Yeah, my time in the startup scene goes back to working in the university sector and then more recently looking at digital startups. So startups that are building things that are online, even if they have a physical product, businesses that are leveraging the internet to scale. And I guess the observation that's come up many times for me is that most people learn by trial and error. And I think, if you're particularly in a regional area where you're not surrounded by large numbers of successful entrepreneurs, it's really hard to do trial and error because what happens is people take an inordinately long time to figure out how to grow their business successfully. And I think, these days, it's pretty well understood what some of the kind of core principles are. And for me, a big part of my focus is helping people who are on that journey to learning how to build a successful business, to kind of short circuit that learning curve and not, fail many times over doing things that, perhaps with a bit of experienced guidance or input, someone might have said, no, don't do that because you're just going to waste a lot of time and money. So my, interest in the startup scene is just helping people to build successful businesses. I think as an economy, Australia needs to get better at building businesses that can grow. And I'm not just talking about, billion-dollar tech unicorns. I'm talking about businesses that, even if they're relatively small, that take an idea or take the kind of skill set of the founders and turn it into something bigger than just self-employment. I think Elena and I have talked about this many times. You can think of companies in a pyramid, right? So if you draw a pyramid, you can say, well, the companies at the top are the ones that are highest value, but there's a very small number of them, right? So there's Facebook and Google and Microsoft and whatever, Atlassian, Canva. The ones at the bottom are the plumbers and sole traders and self-employed. And it doesn't matter whether someone's at the very bottom of that pyramid or somewhere close to the top. I think there's a really crucial role for people like Elena and myself to try and help people to move up the pyramid. Yeah. Right? So even if they're thinking, I want to start a really small business, we go, well, hang on a minute. You can build something a bit bigger and try and encourage and support them to do that.
And I think that's why these programs are so essential too, because it's all well and good to have the theory behind starting a business, but it's that support and that hands-on mentoring and coaching that you actually get that really propels people into action and gets them off the ground. What do you believe are some of the key elements or values that make up the Australian startup culture as a whole? And do you think this differs between regional and metropolitan areas?
For me, I think I'm starting to see a real shift towards what we might think of as the kind of Silicon Valley startup culture, where over decades in Silicon Valley and now a number of other startup ecosystems, people have realized that those ecosystems work through a pay-it-forward approach that says, well, how can we help people who are just getting started with their companies, and without expecting that it's some kind of sell them consulting services or it's actually the kind of virtuous cycle of successful founders giving back and saying, I've got some experience that I can share with people who are coming along, from an earlier stage. And we're seeing that in the regions, absolutely. In the last 5 years, we're seeing people start to realize that that's an important part of that kind of virtuous cycle of skills development and learning. And I think we're also seeing people thinking bigger. I think that's really important, that, as I said before, it's not about necessarily everyone building a $1 billion tech company, but I'm starting to see people changing their attitudes around small business entrepreneurship to more thinking around opportunity-based. What's the opportunity to build something here that just maybe goes a bit beyond what's in my comfort zone? We're getting to the point where we're seeing people reach a bit beyond that comfort zone, and I think in regional, particularly in remote and rural areas, we're seeing that as something that's starting to happen, which I think is really positive.
I'd agree with that. So, the few of the key elements of startup culture in Australia, but also more broadly, there's that collaborative pay it forward aspect that you spoke about, Colin, and that's definitely a bit of a mindset shift for some of our founders coming from more competitive business environments. So that collaborative, supportive culture is something that's a real highlight of the startup community, as opposed to some of the more competitive traditional business communities where people might see the neighbouring business as a competitor rather than a potential partner. That bigger aspirational element of startup culture as well is something that really shines through. Thinking bigger than just competing for customers in your local town. If you're selling globally to the world, then your neighbour is your potential partner who can help you reach a bigger audience, not your competitor for the small limited pie of your local town. And I think the difference between regional and city startup communities, it is a bit like that aspect of regional communities being smaller and a bit further behind compared to city communities in terms of development of that startup culture. One thing that we see in regional areas is you can't be what you can't see. So if a local entrepreneur has never seen people locally start global businesses, they might feel that that's out of reach and that's too big to aim for. Some of the feedback that we've heard from some of our Startup Gippsland participants was, doing this program was the first time that I had people around me who didn't think I was crazy. So that's a big part of why we think it's really important to deliver these kinds of geographically focused communities, because otherwise people might have connections with others online that get how they think. But if they feel isolated within their local community, it can be really quite challenging to overcome those barriers of lack of understanding and judgment among the people they see day to day. So it's important to bring together these people who have that more aspirational mindset and are looking to build a global business that does aim to grow, so that they can support each other, because it is like sometimes quite a lonely journey, entrepreneurship, when you're starting out. So creating those supportive local communities is a really important part of building startup culture, and helping businesses to grow, succeed, and like become more impactful compared to just being a sole trader business.
What valuable insights from both of you. Thank you so much. COVID aside, because we know that's been a massive challenge over the last 2 years, but what other challenges do both of you see for regional Australian startup founders? And do you have any insights into how these, can be overcome?
Look, I think one of the big challenges is what I refer to as startup theatre. I think there's a lot of interest in startups. Most state governments and to some extent the federal government have weighed in to support startup programs and ecosystem building activities, which I think is excellent. But the unintended side effect has been that there's been a whole stack of programs that have come into existence and they have the word startup in them because they know that they can tap into some government funding or that it's going to raise their profile. And I think that's really dangerous. So I think there's an important distinction that needs to be made between programs that are genuinely focusing on startups, and we can debate the definition for a long time, but startups that have the capacity to grow into more substantive businesses. So let's use that as a working definition to start with, versus programs that are really just micro business support centers or the like that use the word startup because it attracts a little bit of currency or makes them look a bit cool or whatever it might be, and obviously helps them to get various sources of funding, but they don't have much economic impact. So if you ask the question, what kind of economy do we want for Australia in the next decade or two? I don't think you'd answer that by saying we want lots more micro businesses that employ one or two people, and someday the people that started those businesses will be able to pay themselves a decent salary and pay off their mortgage. There's nothing wrong with those businesses, and they are important because they support a large percentage of the population. But I think most people would say the economy that we want in the next couple of decades is one where we're globally considered a leader in building meaningful companies that can really enter global markets and employ large numbers of people and create knowledge intensive jobs that are not going to be usurped by low cost of labor countries. And so I think that's probably the biggest challenge that we have nationally, and it's particularly acute, I think, in regional areas because there isn't that kind of track record of building companies that scale.
What are some of the things that people can do? Like, say they're an aspiring entrepreneur and they find a program online. How do they know that that's not just the theatre and the glitz and glamour and that it is the real deal?
So, I guess in terms of program selection and how do you tell the difference between startup theatre versus real startup programs? Look at whether the programs really focus on growth. So it shouldn't be just about starting your business. It should be about growing like a global business. So a lot of startup programs, if they only talk about starting a business, that's not really focused on that kind of growth and bigger ambition. So that's the key factor that I talk about when explaining the difference. That it's a startup is not a business just starting out. It's an early stage business intending to grow.
For regional people, I think there's a lot of value in having a wish list. I always say to startup founders, you should have a wish list, like a spreadsheet or whatever, of all of the people in the world that you'd love to spend half an hour with picking their brains. And people are often surprised at how easy it is to get some one-on-one time with some massively successful entrepreneur somewhere on the other side of the world, just because you've taken the proactive approach of saying, I'm working on this. It's something related to what you've done previously. I have a specific thing I want to get your input on, right? So it's not can we have a shoot the breeze conversation for an hour and I'll buy you coffee. It's I want your input on this specific thing. 9 times out of 10, that person will say, yep, sure, I'm happy to give you the input. So I reckon there's a really simple practical thing that any business owner or entrepreneur can do is to have that wish list and say, who are the people, either by name, if you know them, you know who the person is, or by description. So if you don't know the individual, you can describe them and say, well, somebody who's built a company in this industry, who's done these things, and then do some online research and find that person, track them down, contact them. And like I said, if you ask them a specific question, more than likely you'll get a good response.
So in your opinions, what do you believe it takes to build a successful startup in Australia?
For me, so I've worked with 1,000 startup founders as a coach or a mentor over the years, and there's a couple of really clear trends that I've seen in terms of the behaviors or the personality traits. Probably the most important one for me is grit and determination. The people that succeed as entrepreneurs tend to be the ones that, if you set them a task, they'll complete it faster than you expected. They'll go further than they said they would, and they'll come back and say, well, I've done that. What are the next 5 things I should do? And can you help me with these other things? And can you connect me with this person because I think they could help me as well? And why have you not done it yet? So I think that's kind of the proactive part of it. There's the other bit of it is the resilience, where building a startup, building any business is hard, but building a startup that's doing something different and innovative is probably the hardest thing you can do in business. And there's lots of setbacks, there's lots of failures, there's lots of times when people say to themselves, why am I doing this? It seems like a really crazy thing to be pursuing because it may not work and it might fail and there's risk attached to it. But the people who succeed tend to be the ones that keep picking themselves back up and saying, well, I'm just going to keep doing it. I don't care if the first 20 customers that I talk to tell me they're not interested in my product. At some point they need to care because, if they don't listen to that, at some point it's insanity. But I think, being able to say, well, I'll push through that, I'll learn from what I hear from all those rejections, and I'll iterate my product or my offering, and eventually I'll get there. I think that really matters a lot.
Yeah, the growth mindset and learning mindset is one of the things that to me stands out. Like as a startup mentor, one of the things that I personally really look for in startups that I work with is coachability and willingness to learn from your experiences. So not being so attached to your view of the world that you ignore the reality of what the world actually is and what your customers are telling you. Like everybody ends up dealing with rejection, and you need to be able to overcome rejection and have that resilient mindset. But resilience isn't the same thing as doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. It's being able to go back and try something different over and over 20 different times, 100 different times. So one of the examples that I tend to use when I'm speaking to startups about those kinds of personal qualities is like that. For example, Thomas Edison had 10,000 failures before he actually succeeded in inventing a light bulb. And there's that great quote that it wasn't that he failed 10,000 times, it was he learned 10,000 ways not to invent a light bulb. So as long as he was learning from that and iterating every single one of those tests, that's not the same thing as doing the same thing over and over and expecting something different. So successful startup founders are the ones who keep coming back and changing their approach every time, learning from their failures, not just experiencing failures and continuing to try the same thing. And another factor that I would say is important for successful startup founders is a practical approach to risk management. So people tend to think of entrepreneurs as risk takers, and in some ways they are compared to like the standard career path that we expect in society of like getting a job and working for someone else. Like you're taking on that risk if this business idea doesn't succeed. But to actually succeed as an entrepreneur, you need to be willing to manage risk. So not overspending, like not putting too many of your eggs in one basket, but testing things out in small, simple ways that minimize the amount of time, effort, and money that you're risking in any one idea. Because the more you can reduce your risk by testing and validating and actually reducing risk as quickly and cheaply as possible, the more likely you are to find the path that actually succeeds.
And I think that's why these startup ecosystems are so important as well, because, you know, it's all well and good to think that, you know, success is easy as a startup, but actually having those people that you can see their journey and the steps that they've taken, the lessons they've learned through their failures, you know, because it is largely mindset based and being adaptable and being coachable. So having those people that you can actually see going through that journey themselves as well, it sort of helps keep you, you know, like, I don't want to say checked into reality, but it does, because you see, okay, well, this isn't a 12-month thing that I'm suddenly going to become a unicorn. Like, this is going to be 10 years, 15 years down the track.
Maybe worth just mentioning something that I found people tend to struggle with is the idea that they go, I'm going to start a business. And they then, the next thought is, I'll have to quit my job or stop doing whatever it is I'm doing that earns an income and take all of this risk all at once and go really, really fast, because if I don't start, you know, making some money out of this new business, then it's all over and, you know, life's terrible. But it's generally not a good idea to do that. Most people are much better off starting with small time commitments, exploring an idea, you know, talking to customers, potential customers, learning about what they should build in terms of the product or the service that's going to meet that customer's need. You know, bring in a couple of people to maybe help with them as collaborators or maybe co-founders, but on a small part-time basis, and just make little steps. And it might take 6 or 12 months, or in some cases even longer. But what happens is the risk or the uncertainty around that business decreases over time, and then it gets to a point where you can say, I now think it's valid for me to increase my, you know, time commitment and, if necessary, financial commitment to really go after this. And it actually, particularly now in light of the economic turmoil that we've had going through COVID, and the fact that, you know, there's a lot of people that are looking at changing careers or they're losing their jobs, I think startups are actually not that risky, you know, if you do it in a stepped, staged way.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think people talk a lot about the number of small businesses that fail within the first 3 years. But I think part of it is just the language that we use. If you look at the statistics, those numbers relate not to businesses that went bankrupt, but to businesses that were no longer operating in 3 years. There could be all sorts of reasons for the business no longer operating. Like, just to pick one example, my mum decided to move interstate to be closer to her grandchildren, and she shut down her location-based business in Tasmania, and then ended up setting up a new business in WA. Now, that's technically a business that is counted as no longer operating, so it would be counted as a business that failed in that situation. But is that really a failure from her own kind of career development perspective and her life decisions? We wouldn't say that employee failed because they didn't last in their job longer than 3 years. That's complete nonsense. But we do talk that way about entrepreneurs. So as long as the person has learned something from the experience that they've perceived as valuable, and they've moved on to something that suits their life better, that shouldn't be considered a failure. That's just a reasoned career decision for them to make.
Yeah, because there's so many transferable skills that come from starting a business and running a business that can be applied into your next venture, and you might find you're passionate about something else. And yeah, it's so true. That's such a valid point, Elena. What are some of the emerging trends that you're seeing for startups in regional Australia right now?
I think this is actually a really exciting time to be starting a startup in regional Australia, because the tyranny of distance, like the barriers to engaging, like selling online, building partnerships, building, accessing investment virtually, are lower than they've ever been in the past. Like the change in engagement with remote work and remote collaboration over the past 2 years, we've seen basically 10 years of development compressed into the space of 2 years because of COVID. So I think more and more we're seeing that there's less barriers to starting a business in a regional area and starting a startup in a regional area compared to what there have been in the past. But basically, like, my thoughts around trends for regional startups is we're going to see a flourishing of regional startups, because entrepreneurs are realizing that if they're building a global company and they have the skills and network and ability to do business online, there's no reason why they shouldn't set up their business in a small country town rather than in the city. They'd be paying less for rent. They'd have a lovely supportive community. They'd have no commute to work. So there's all sorts of advantages to starting a business and like starting a global startup in a regional area right now. The regional founders, they need to reach out beyond their local community because the people they're surrounded by are likely to be on the same kind of stage of development as them. So that outreach to communities outside of their own has become easier and easier over the past few years. So I think that ability to access support beyond their local area is going to continue to grow over the next few years.
Yeah. We've certainly found that in a lot of the programs that we've been delivering over the last 3 years, in particular our online founders course, which is essentially a self-contained online program. People can do it individually or as part of a cohort. And we've now had more than 1,000 entrepreneurs in Australia and some overseas go through that.
Wow.
And if you look at where those people are distributed geographically, there are lots and lots of them that are in very small regional and rural areas where they may well be the only person that they know in their network in that area that's building a high growth company. But because they're able to access an online program and connect with their peers in other places, geography becomes a whole lot less important to them. So I think that's something that is nice to see happening.
It was a real theme that they go hand in hand, you know. It's great to be part of your local community, but also be expanding out. So I think for you listeners, some homework for you is to develop your wish list that Colin was talking about, of some of those people that you can reach out to that are outside of your local area, and seek some feedback on your idea or, you know, your business. Well, Elena, Colin, it was an absolute pleasure to sit down with you both today and learn more about the future of Australia's regional startup community and how you're both supporting founders in this space, because it's a very exciting time.
Welcome, it's been fun.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe. Yeah.
So if you'd like to get in touch with Colin, you can reach out via email to colin@startuponramp.com. And if you'd like to get in touch with Elena, email the team at hello@startupgippsland.com.au. So that's all for today, folks. Be sure to tune into the next episode where I sit down with a very exciting guest who's graced Australian TV screens before setting his sights into the world of startups. Until then, keep dreaming big, taking action, following your entrepreneurial pursuits, and showing the world that the best ideas can come from the smallest of backyards.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Startup Gippsland Live. Please be sure to subscribe, and if you're enjoying the show, we'd love for you to leave us a review. We can't wait to have you tune in again soon. For more great resources and business tips, make sure you head over to our website, startupgippsland.com.au, your home for Gippsland entrepreneurs.